So we'll get started. It's a pleasure to introduce Brian Southwell today, our speaker. We've been trying to schedule Brian now for a little over a year, so it's been incredibly difficult. Many of you know Brian, but also see a lot of other faces. Brian has an appointment in our school, but he's also a senior research scientist at RTI. And since his grad student days, Brian has been a very prolific scholar. His in the areas of science and health communication, one of the best known names in our field today. His dissertation won the Health Communication Dissertation Award of the Year, jointly awarded by both ICA and NCA. And Brian has done a lot of great work on many different aspects of science and health communication over the years. One of the many things that I like about his research, what's always something which, for the first time I read some of his work, it's got me to greater interest, was the elegance of the writing. He's always been such a really elegant writer across so many different articles, across so many different methodologies, pretty conversant with both theory and methodology equally. The other thing which also sort of arrested my attention is he tends to look at the large picture too. So it's not just looking at it in terms of the micro aspects, but really goes beyond that and looks at a lot of the larger picture surmises as well. This is also reflected in some of his work. Brian is one of the few people in our field, for example, who's had a lot of success in looking at large-scale evaluation campaigns. And this is really, his work has been funded by pretty much all the major agencies, including the NIH, the NSF, and he's also spoken to different behaviors and many diverse audiences. So this is looked at it in terms of the Office of the National Drug Control Policy's anti-drug efforts. It's looked at it in terms of the CDC's efforts at cancer screening and promotion screening tests. So it's looked at it in terms of some of the FDA's work on some of the things with tobacco. So it really spans across so many different things too. He is currently a senior editor at Health Communication and also serves on a variety of editorial boards. And like I said, his publishing record is pretty prolific. Pretty much published in a lot of the top health comm, mass comm, and interdisciplinary journals, including comm research, comm theory, social science and medicine, JQ, so on and so forth. His work today, his presentation today is about social networks, and this is something which really emerged from his work on examining those factors which moderate mass media campaign effects. And this is something which actually sort of led to his editing a guest editing an issue of comm theory, I think back in 2009, right? Mm-hmm. And for all of you, but especially all the PhD students in here, I would strongly recommend that you pick up that article. It's got a ton of information. It's a great example of how you focus on one certain area and then you put together a great list of articles. So he's going to be talking about that today. So welcome.
Great, thanks so much, Sri. That was a very warm welcome, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate these several opportunities I've had over the last year to continue to get introduced to folks. Any delay in scheduling a colloquium presentation, certainly not for lack of enthusiasm on my part. And this is really a highlight in my month in terms of my schedule. It's great to get a chance to talk and to see some new faces and some different folks. I want to frame the discussion today in a lot of ways as both apropos of the topic as a conversation and as really a solicitation of opportunities for collaboration. And so I want to talk about some ideas that have seemed apparent to me in the last few years in thinking about this general topic and theme. But you'll see that I really am framing this very much in terms of what is left to be done and other questions that are left to be answered. Now, my own route into this work, which is partly what I'm going to describe, has been animated by a seemingly mundane question. In attempting to understand and predict health behavior, which is where a lot of this started, time and time again, it seemed that there may be reasons why the mundane connections between people actually matter. That said, this is intersection that is surprisingly unexplored, or has been until recent years. Those of you that are familiar with the structures of our academic conferences, ICA is a great example of this, where we've got really wholly separate focus on interpersonal communication and mass communication, and often never the twain shall meet. And a lot of my own agenda has been about knitting together those areas, even within our sort of discipline of communication, let alone some of the other interdisciplinary connections that really are necessary for us to explore, and not just a good or nice idea. I've been particularly interested in the ways in which those connections between people might affect the ways that we come to understand the impact and effects of large-scale mass media campaigns. That's been a large part of my own work. But there's a lot that we might take away from this discussion today that doesn't necessarily just have to do with evaluation of large-scale campaigns, for example, to promote public health. And you'll see where I'm going with that in just a minute. Well, it seems, in a lot of ways, that this talk and some of the reaction that I've had to some of this work, comes at a moment where many people are talking about social networks and the connections between people. In fact, this is an idea that we hear in myriad news stories, and this is something that very much fills the airwaves in recent years in terms of popular commentary. And you can argue, however, a bit cynically, that actually what this new focus and attention has unveiled is the simple realization that, in fact, at the end of the day, people talk to one another. This is not an altogether earth-shattering revelation, right? This is something that we've known for quite some time, and yet people are acting as though this is something altogether new. And we see this manifest in all kinds of ways. And certainly within the advertising and public relations arena, there's increasing focus on the notion of viral marketing. And just our general interest in social media, you can argue, somewhat reflects this new attention. Well, this has come to a head a bit in recent years, academically. Shri mentioned the special issue that I had the opportunity to co-edit with my colleague Marco Iser a few years ago in communication theory. That was compelling for me, actually, in terms of the amount of pent-up demand that there seemed to be amongst scholars in terms of talking about some of these issues. So the number of submissions that we received, the review commentary, this is not a new topic, and yet one that people were happy to be talking about in a systematic way. And so in this particular special issue, we started to look at the ways in which conversations might matter with regards to campaigns, and not just simply the observation that, in fact, they might. Well, of course, all of this, even in academic circles, is not new terrain. There are a number of different touch points that we might look back to see instances where people have started to realize that interpersonal connections matter in our conceptualization of mass communication and our conceptualization of public opinion. One place we can turn, for example, we turn the clock back roughly a century or so to the French sociologist Gabriel Tarde, and certainly at that point in time, he's focusing on the role of talk, whether it be in salons or in public cafes, as we start to understand what's later going to be known as public opinion, as it gurgles up from these interactions between people. Certainly a bit more famous example, move the clock ahead about 50 years, and we have the notion of the two-step flow as it occurs and as it's talked about in Katz and Lazarsfeld's Personal Influence, which is an oft-cited volume, and yet one that I would argue that in many instances, many of those citations, authors haven't necessarily gone back and read every word of the original. And so there's quite a bit of reference to this general idea, but there's been surprising lack of empirical follow-up. Katz himself would argue that this is true. And there is a lack of engagement sometimes with some of the original ideas as they're laid out. So this, by virtue of the telephone game, has become this sort of reified, generic idea without us really going back to examine what some of the possibilities might be. And certainly interwoven all along the way, this story can't be told without thinking a little bit about the lineage and scholarly tradition as it relates to the diffusion of innovations and the diffusion of information. And so Ev Rogers and a number of others certainly acknowledge the connections between people as a mechanism whereby information might spread. In much of the work in the 20th century, though, that explicitly considers talk and connections between people, those connections are really simply seen as conduit. This is a mechanism whereby messages might spread indirectly. And so you might view, say, the two-step flow notion as really a re-articulation of the idea that messages might be spread indirectly, that exposure might be extended by virtue of conversations between people. So you might assume that there are certain key ideas that I'm talking about here today. We characterize all of you as thought leaders in your particular own social circles. You go forward and talk about things that Southwell talked about today directly, and thereby other people are exposed to some of these ideas. What's probably more likely, however, is that those conversations, A, it might be a pipe dream that anything like that's going to happen, and B, they might be equally likely to talk about all kinds of other things. Like, gosh, Southwell came to talk today, but it wasn't all that interesting. Or there might be other ways that you might add your own commentary to what it was that I originally suggested. Okay? So there's both this notion that we might indirectly extend media exposure, but we also more recently have recognized that there are much more complex ways that we can think about those conversations as they might complicate that exposure itself. Okay? So a few years ago, in Communication Yearbook, Marco and I had the opportunity to kind of exhaustively look at the literature today and to articulate what some plausible roles might be. And in that overview, we came up with at least three that seem to be useful to pay attention to. One is this notion that I've already talked about, the sort of indirect spread of exposure. You might think about that as a mediator of sorts. You might think about talk as a mechanism through which either exposure is extended or through which campaigns have some kind of impact. But there are also plenty of instances where talk itself is simply an outcome of interest. Think about instances where people are attempting to engage families and to generate talk between parents and their kids. In those circumstances, talk is the outcome. So that is the behavior that we're interested in. In the journalistic realm, it's often the case that this is about as far as one can go in terms of expecting or hoping for any sort of outcome. For about 4 years, when I was at the University of Minnesota, I headed up the evaluation for an NSF-funded project that was intended to raise the quality of science journalism in local television news reporting. And in that instance, NSF was only willing to go just so far as this outcome variable of public dialogue. So they wanted people talking about these issues. You might think about this in a way that connects with and thinking about agenda setting. That this is really about as far as people are willing to go without necessarily an overt persuasive outcome. Whether or not those two things can be completely distinct is an open question, of course, but that's something we have to pay some attention to. There's also a third possibility, however. There's a possibility that campaigns or active efforts to engage publics themselves don't generate much talk directly. But nonetheless, that there are networks of conversations that occur that affect and mitigate or amplify those efforts. So there's all kinds of naturally occurring conversation that's topically relevant to material that goes out there into the atmosphere. And you might not generate a conversation by virtue of a campaign, but it may well be the case that conversations as they exist and occur have some impact on the extent to which certain messages are remembered relative to others, and has an impact as to what it is that ultimately people are thinking about and what gets pushed off of that public agenda. And so it makes sense for us to pay attention to these networks and these conversations that occur, even if they aren't directly generated by the campaign itself. Well, all of this suggests that the time has come, this is really something we should have thought about a long time ago, to really revisit our conceptualization of audience. And so it really invites us to think about ways that we can move beyond what's often implicit in much of our discussion, particularly when it comes to campaigns, in which we think about audiences as a group of atomized individuals, some of whom are reached by messages, others of whom are not. And so this might be our conventional view, whereby by virtue of this original broadcast message, we've got some folks who are characterized as being within the audience and other folks that aren't. Well, obviously, one of the realizations that we've made is that folks who are in that audience often are connected to one another. And this has all kinds of implications for the echo effect that might occur and for amplification that might occur within that audience. We've also realized that folks might well be connected to people outside of that group. Okay? And so, there, Joe Bob. So we really need to start to think about the ways that this overlaid set of network connections matter. And we have to acknowledge that in our basic understanding of audiences as they relate to mass communication in general. So it really calls into question that general notion of the mass itself. Well, we could just stop there, but it wouldn't be very interesting, and we have a lot of time left. And so why don't we move ahead to think about the more interesting ways in which the picture gets more complex. There are a lot of questions that are yet to be addressed. It's one thing to say that conversation might occur, that by virtue of this, that certain people are going to be connected and others aren't to the original campaign. We really need to start to ask the questions about who it is that is doing this talking. Are there disparities in and amongst groups and within individuals in terms of who it is that is both connected and has access to these conversations and is generating the talk in the first place? Why is it that they're doing this? Why would anybody ever talk about a public service announcement, let alone other pieces of media content? Are there unintended consequences? Are there ways in which these dynamics may well lead to consequences and outcomes that campaigns themselves that were attempting to harness social networks may have not anticipated? And I want to talk about those because I think they're quite interesting. And are there variables that we have to start paying attention to that are undoubtedly related, but that are not exactly talk, or not exactly conversation per se? Well, I want to get to that in just a minute as we start to define what it is that we might mean by conversation. But I want you to start thinking about forwarding an email or posting on Facebook or other related behaviors that have to come under our theoretical umbrella here, but that probably aren't the same thing as what we might define as a face-to-face conversation. Before we get too excited, also, a lot of folks have thought about trying to pull these ideas into the applied arena and to start to harness social networks. And there are some initial caveats, plus some caveats that come out of some of the work that I've done that suggest that, in fact, this may not be the best idea in the world. We know, for example, that people tend to connect with others that they know. This almost inherently suggests that there's not a limitless opportunity for the spread of information, that you're going to see certain cul-de-sacs under certain circumstances, whereby people are only connecting with those that they already know, and you're not going to allow, by virtue of a handful of people initially having access to a message, indefinite spread. Second, it's certainly the case, and we can start to hint here towards the disparities that I want to talk about. The socioeconomic circumstances are going to matter, both individually and structurally, in terms of networks as they exist. Okay? So we'll talk about both of those here in just a minute. That said, I've gotten roughly 20 minutes into a talk without actually defining what we mean by conversation. And I think this is a great group to start to generate some ideas. I think it's worthwhile spending just a minute doing this because our very definition of and how we understand and conceptualize conversation will probably lead the way theoretically towards some ideas that are going to be useful for the rest of our consideration. So with that in mind, I'm curious, if you were to turn around and needed to talk to an undergrad or a family member or somebody not in Carroll Hall about what it is that we mean by conversation, how would you define it? How would we actually put some bounds around this conceptually? What is this phenomenon that we're actually talking about? What counts as a conversation? Does anybody have any idea that there are any anybody willing to go out on a limb here and define it? What do you think? Yeah.
Two-way exchange of information.
Okay, so you've got a couple pieces in what you're talking about. There's information involved, whatever that is, an exchange of some sort, and you're going to have two ways, so you're going to include multiple people. So it's going to probably be the case that dyads or groups, something other than an individual is going to matter. We've all been with folks, perhaps, we have some of those in our lives who are very good at internal monologues, or people that spend a lot of time muttering to themselves, but we probably want to think about this as being defined inherently as involving a couple of people. and that there needs to be some exchange, what interpersonal scholars would label as co-orientation or mutual engagement in this phenomenon that we're talking about. Okay? I want to go a bit further, and I want to suggest that conversation itself is going to comprise strategic behavior. Now, lest you think that I'm not a romantic in my vision of humanity, that's actually the farthest thing from the truth. I want to suggest that what I'm not saying by this is not that I think people are crassly attempting to manipulate one another under all circumstances, but simply to say every time you open your mouth or engage in this behavior that you have some reason or purpose for doing so. You might think about an exchange that you have with somebody in the stairwell about what a beautiful day it is today. Chances are that you're doing that in part to acknowledge that they are part of this community that we live in. And you can think about circumstances in which you very explicitly attempt not to engage somebody. Okay? And so I want to argue that all of those things are strategic behavior. The only reason I have for doing that is that all of a sudden life gets more interesting when you argue that this is going to be goal-oriented behavior. It's going to be driven by human needs and desires, and so the story is going to get much more interesting in that regard. And it's going to suggest that this is a force that inherently is not very easy to harness. So we can't just push a button and expect that people are going to discuss or talk. In fact, I'm sure that many of us have had that experience in our classes when you haven't given a sufficient prompt and you sort of expect people to talk with their neighbor about something and you're dead silence. It's not going to be the easiest thing to necessarily encourage this to occur, and it may not be a force that's particularly easy to rein in once it's actually occurring. All that matters for how we might think about it as it relates to campaigns. It suggests that conversations are not an automatic consequence of exposure. So we can't get overly excited about this as something that we can automatically count on in the same way that we can, assuming that it's audited, count on an ad buy. Okay? It's going to require that people have, often in many circumstances, some modicum of motivation and skills. Again, we've all been with folks who are more or less skilled in conversation, probably. And also, and this is going to have implication for memory and for other types of variables that might be of interest, it's going to require some small degree of cognitive activation, which probably varies as a function of who you're talking with, but nonetheless, it's going to require that certain ideas are prompted. And insofar as those ideas are prompted, it means that things can get reinforced. And it means that there are possibilities for not only persuasion, but for amplification and reification of particular ideas. What's going to matter for our consideration today is that conversation itself is also probably constrained by context and by opportunity. If I go wander to my car after this talk and there's nobody else on campus, and it'd be a beautiful day out, but unless I pick up the cell phone or do something else, I don't have access to a conversation that I might have with somebody about the last hour. It requires that there be some opportunity for you to engage. You might think about the extent to which this is going to matter for folks that are ensconced in actively conversant networks and folks that are not. Okay? And also, there are certain circumstances in which this type of information exchange can occur, and others in which it's going to be inherently constrained. Well, so all this suggests that as we start to move out from the individual and think about other units of analysis that are of interest, we might start to describe networks as one thing that may well be of interest. So there are going to be certain network characteristics that likely matter. A couple of them to keep in mind. The possibility that just the amount of information or knowledge in circulation in a network may well have an impact. You might think about the analog to the old knowledge gap work as it might occur in networks themselves. And we might see conversation gaps in similar ways that we saw knowledge gaps to begin with. Second, network density probably matters in certain ways. The extent to which people are not only connected but connected to one another also probably has a direct impact on these possibilities. And last, a notion that we might put under the larger heading of social capital, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The availability of so-called community ties or ties between people probably matter. And so the extent to which a certain community is richer in these connections as opposed to another probably predisposes them to talk more or less and to be more or less impacted by efforts to engage through this mechanism. So here's where you start worrying about these things. Insofar as we're moving headlong into what's been labeled and deemed the network society, we might argue that this is not necessarily going to lead to inherent democratic ideals, but there may be circumstances under which essentially the rich get richer. And you might start to think about inequity and disparity in some key and important ways. So we'll get back to that notion here in just a second when we get a chance to look at that empirically. Okay, well, speaking of empirically, I want to talk briefly about a couple of papers that I've worked on in recent years that are animated by some of these ideas, but also point the way towards some new directions. So in Minnesota, where I had the great honor and pleasure of spending about a decade, I'd had built up relationships with the Minnesota Department of Health, which does all kinds of interesting work. It's one of the leading state health departments in the country, and they are really, in some ways, from an applied standpoint, on the cutting edge of a lot of various efforts. What they do often, though, is work that they wouldn't necessarily label as explicitly being theoretically interesting. They're just trying to do what works. And along the way, some of those projects, I think, intersect with our discussion here in some interesting ways. So one project that they have been doing for a number of years is a federally funded effort to essentially give away free mammograms. They've attempted to reach the underinsured and the uninsured women in Minnesota who are eligible for this program and to offer mammography for screening for breast cancer. Now, they've tried to advertise this effort in all kinds of ways. One of the ways that they do this is working in conjunction with local television news. They do a lot of phone banking. They do public service announcements. They do all kinds of conventional broadcast and outreach. However, they also recognize that much of their audience is not necessarily paying attention to the local nightly news. And many of the people that they want to reach are essentially, quote unquote, off the grid, or maybe, quote unquote, harder to reach. So how is it that you're going to reach those folks? Well, one thing that they've decided to do was to take those folks that they've already reached and to try to leverage the networks of the existing program participants. So they have what they label a refer a friend program, whereby current program participants can nominate friends and family to also participate in the program. It seems natural as a place where we might look, given these other ideas, right? So here is essentially a viral marketing effort that a local public health, a state public health department is engaged in, and yet they've done this as a pilot project without really a lot of empirical inquiry. And so I spent quite a bit of time working with them to add that empirical inquiry and sort of also think about some ways in which they might optimize the program. All of that's fed into both answering some questions that we've raised so far and raising some new directions. Well, I suspect this audience, I don't really need to make the case as to why this is a justifiable approach in terms of providing breast cancer screening for the underinsured. But just in case you have a question about that, there are all kinds of ways in which reaching women at an earlier stage, offering screening services, improves outcomes. There are important ethical questions that we might ask about the extent to which we're feeding women into a system whereby they may or may not have all of the supports that they might ultimately need. We can talk about that. But this is really, I want to just put this on the table as here's a site for interesting research, and we can come back to those issues if need be. My own interpretation and sense of the experience in Minnesota was that there were really two prominent themes that emerged. And these are themes that are each articulated separately in these two papers that I want to talk about. The first is the surprising opportunities that seem to be afforded by altruism. This is something that is both heartwarming and uplifting, but also critically important observation when it comes to state budgets and realizing the constraints that we might have financially. I'll get to that point in just a second. But second are the limitations of this kind of peer-to-peer outreach. How far can you push the envelope in trying to do this work, and what are the limitations that you might run into along the way? I want to first briefly acknowledge that my collaborators in the Minnesota Department of Health were quite open to us exploring these questions, even though some of them don't shed the best light ultimately on the program's successes and failures. And I've appreciated that. It's sometimes rare in doing this type of work, and that's something that I always like to briefly acknowledge. Okay, so here's an example of what SAGE does. They look and try to reach current program participants in a variety of ways. In this instance, through direct mail, they're actually sending these nomination cards out. So you can see here what's important in the back of the room. You probably can't see all of this, but that these are lines whereby somebody might provide a name and a contact information, a cell phone number or a mailing address. There's a brief invitation, but not a whole lot here in terms of message. What we're essentially doing is reaching out and expecting people to contribute names of others who might be contacted by the program. At the core, that's really what this program's all about. Okay. I thought there were at least two questions that are really interesting to ask. One is, how is it that you might optimize the degree of nomination that's occurring? One question is whether or not financial incentives would work. In this particular case, we had a state that was open to spending money on this, and so we raised that question. Can you pay people to give you names, essentially? And is that going to work better or worse than other strategies? The second question is whether or not there are community-level disparities in the efficacy of these efforts. Insofar as there are, you might really start to be concerned, or at least keep in your mind that this is an important caveat in getting excited about this work. So one papers that I want to talk about, some of the results are written up in the American Journal of Health Promotion. And we did an experiment with roughly 3,000 participants who were assigned to one of three conditions. They were either, all these were program participants, but they were given the opportunity to either get an extra $5 for every name they submitted. They were offered, in a second condition, $20 for every completed mammogram amongst somebody who they nominated. So you didn't get paid just for the name, you only got paid when there was follow-through in terms of completion of the mammogram. In the third case, we just asked for names. It was a solicitation of volunteer nominations, and there was no financial incentive attached. So I'm curious, just in the abstract, we've got very smart people in the room, what do you think worked best? Which of these three would you put your money on as actually having been the most effective here?
Well, what's the outcome?
Okay, right. So this is a great first question to ask. What counts as working, right? Okay. How might that color your own view of this? What does that? I mean, so are there ways in which?
I'm going to pay $5 per name, and that's for an end. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of names.
Okay, we'll come back to that point in a second. Darren, is that another?
I was actually guessing I was going to say a guess, but I think he brings up a good layer between.
Okay, well, what was your other guess going to be?
I was going to guess that the solicitation of volunteer nominations without the financial incentive would actually generate the most effective.
Okay, so we've got rival hypotheses on some level that are partly a function of which of these outcomes we're going to focus in on. And you can argue that there are different outcomes that are going to be of interest, but the MDH went into this essentially initially hoping to get as many names as they could. But there's a different story to be told depending on how you frame effectiveness, and that's something that we'll talk about. Okay, so we're right on the same page in thinking about this. Slide header sort of gives away the ultimate story here. But I do want to, so those who were paid to provide names did in fact provide more names. Okay, that's probably not going to shock anybody. And there's an important caveat here, those who actually volunteered to provide names offered what we might label as a richer pool. And there are a couple of ways to frame that, but there's one that we kind of honed in on. If you look at scheduled mammograms, per card that was sent out, and per nomination, and per in terms of both thinking about it in terms of the total, those who volunteered ultimately ended up being responsible for as many mammograms, if not more, in one circumstance, than those who were actually paid to do so. Now, before you get too cynical about that, the $5 per name, there was some check on it. So, a nomination of Minnie Mouse, needed to be verified, and we'd find Seth out, in terms of sending out all those names. You got to watch Seth under many circumstances. I got to remember that next time I send something your way. But so there was a check in terms of making sure that this person existed somehow in the databases that they had. Was this verifiable through a variety of different address lookups or phone number lookups? But nonetheless, there's still no check on whether or not they're eligible or any of that. And so that probably led to a lot of noise in the system. Here's the outcome, but I can just direct your attention here quickly to the rank order of this. So there are a couple of different columns here, but this particular column here are the average nominees per invitation sent. And you can see here that it is roughly in the rank order. All these numbers are different than one another, but the $5 per nominee condition did the best, $20 per condition per mammogram did the second best, and volunteerism, or the altruism condition, we can talk about whether or not that's an appropriate label, did the third best. The story gets much more interesting when you look at completed mammograms, and that's what we find in this last column. And so the rank order shifts around, and you actually see the volunteer condition performing what we might label as most effectively. Okay. So that's an interesting story, but it's one really about maximizing nomination. What also becomes interesting, though, and Shri sort of alluded to this before, I think that both individual level factors are useful to look at, but we also often need to think about community level factors, things that might constrain a person that may or may not be under their control. And so back in 2010, we published a piece in which we looked across the whole state at whether or not there was neighborhood level variation in the extent to which nomination occurred. Won't surprise you too much for me to suggest that, in fact, that turned out to be the case. It's part of the reason that the paper, I think, was of interest. But nonetheless, I want to walk through this for a couple of reasons. One is that I find these results compelling and interesting and a little bit, not necessarily disheartening, but I think worth our attention. But they also raise some questions about how to do this work. And I want to be very open about the fact that I think that the measures and the approaches that we took are not perfect. And they are really a matter of trying to patch together some available secondary or available existing systemic data that we had. Are there ways to improve on this? And this is something I want to talk about. And are there ways in which and reasons why this is perhaps a set of results that's unique to mammography in Minnesota in the past decade? I don't know. And that's the question that we can raise and ask. But here's what we went into this study suggesting, that there are a couple of factors that ought to matter at that community level. And so again, we want to think about contextual factors that are measurable and that are theoretically resident at the community level, not things that are a function of an individual person. And so these community ties, this is a notion that you might think about the extent to which a community has connections to one another and whether the people within that group are connected. Residential stability simply refers to the amount of turnover that occurs in a community. So these are both rightly measured at the community level. We have some rough proxies for both. Okay? It's also probably is the case that we really need to actually look at these functional ties that exist and not just warm and fuzzy feelings of general perceptions of trust. So this is a place, there's a section in the paper that reflects a really interesting exchange that we had with reviewers as to how well this work informs and whether we ought to be using the label social capital. So this is a popular phrase, one that many people are familiar with. I view what we're doing as operationally under that umbrella. But I also have real problems with the general notion of social capital as something that's frustrating in terms of how it's operationalized in many different ways and how exactly it is that we ought to be thinking about this. So if we're going to think about this at the community level, if we're going to think about this as a force that may have not only positive but also potentially negative impacts, we need to think about things like community ties rather than just sort of general perceptions that are measured at the individual level. So here's what we did. We had responses from all across the state, but we wanted to look at the zip code level. I recognize that a zip code is not a perfect indicator of a neighborhood, but it was functional for our purposes in terms of organizing all these different pieces of data that we had. And so what we ended up doing was aggregate about 1,500 responses that were clustered in the 91 zip codes where there were the most folks. We had a threshold, so we didn't want to be looking at a zip code where there was only one or two people. You might have had Seth in your zip code, for example, would throw everything off in terms of being particularly generalizable. And so you wanted some degree of stability. You wanted to have a zip code where you had 10, 15, 20 people at least, so you're getting the average was fair in terms of representing that particular area. Here's perhaps the second bullet point is relatively innocuous and just being residing up there, but it may be the most controversial part of what I'll talk about today. We wanted to find a way to measure community ties. And the way that we chose to do that was actually to look at religious congregation density. This is not specific to any one religion, but we looked at IRS data on the density of congregations in particular zip codes, arguing that this is not certainly the only way to tap into or assess community ties, but this ought to be perhaps one indicator. an indicator of situations where there are connections between people. We argued that by and large, all else being equal, the more of these that existed, the more connections between people, the more likely you're going to see nomination and referral. We followed that through. We controlled for a number of things that you probably are already starting to think about in the study, and we'll present the results. Am I convinced that this is the only way to look at this? No, certainly not. Am I convinced that this is the best way to look at it? No, but I do think it's probably the easiest and the most easily, readily available, given data that we had at hand, and I think it makes some conceptual sense to look at this. So we looked at the National Center for Charitable Statistics publishes this data. From the census itself, we had housing turnover data, so we could look at residential stability, and we had a number of other census-level characteristics that were available to us. For community referral tendency, here's what we did. We actually looked at the number of cards that were sent out, and we looked at the number of nominations that we got back, and we standardized everything by virtue of the number of cards that were sent out. So you might live in an area where there just aren't very many eligible women, and by and large, you might only get 10 cards that were sent to that zip code. We wanted to adjust for the fact that some zip codes were going to get 10 cards, others are going to get 300. So we're dividing by the number of cards that were sent. So what we have ultimately is an indication of 27514. We send these zip codes. How did they respond as a zip code? What was the extent of nomination that occurred? What was the nomination tendency? Well, before I move too far ahead, I need to convince you perhaps that there's variance on these variables at the zip code level. And here is a wildly, both illustrative table and one that I wouldn't want to put too much on because it as an N of 4 at the end of the day. But what we did is we took the top two zip codes and the bottom two zip codes in terms of religious congregation density. You can see here that these are the bottom two, and these are the top two. And then we looked at the nominations per invitation sent, and it's directly in line with what you would expect. The highest performing nominating zip codes were those with the highest religious congregation density, roughly 2 nominations for every invitation that was sent out. And those that were hovering around 0 at the bottom end of our range, ultimately our study nominations ranged from 0 to 2, and you see that it's perfectly aligned with the top and the bottom. But I need to go much further than that, obviously, to convince you that there is this relationship there. And so here's what we did. We ended up using Tobit regression. And so as just a brief methodological side note, why did we do that? We did that because by and large, there wasn't a lot of nomination. So we've got a lot of what's known as zero clustering in the data. And so we've got a relatively rare occurrence, which you can argue is disheartening on some level, but nonetheless this is what occurred. So most people aren't doing this. Most zip codes aren't doing this. And so in order to account for that, it's not fair to use just basic linear regression tendencies. We had to model this in a slightly different way. So we used Tobit regression. But what you can pay attention to is whether or not there's a positive and significant coefficient. And you can see in this first pass-through, in this first model, that congregation density, in fact, holds up. We controlled for a number of things. We controlled for education, so the percentage without high school. We controlled for poverty, for the number of relevant women, roughly speaking, for mammography for most of the program, population size, and we actually included residential stability in this first model and found that it did not, in fact, hold a main effect. That said, we also looked at this as a function of high and low residential stability, and we found that residential stability probably does operate as a moderator. So the short story is that this model holds up. It holds up quite well, but it really tells the most compelling story for high residential stability areas. So now we're starting to paint a picture. Higher congregation density in higher and more stable areas, this is where you're seeing the bulk of the nomination that's occurring. Now flip back and remember the ultimate goals of this program. They're attempting to reach the unreachable. They're attempting to rectify some of the disparities that exist. And yet, even within this, we're seeing a replication of disparity. So the relatively well-off, those who are living in relatively stable communities, who are in relatively connected places, are the ones who are benefiting from this program. It's not to suggest that this undermines the overall goals, but it's an interesting replication and one that was a bit eye-opening. In fact, it was quite eye-opening for MDH to look at this. So what does all this mean? I want to leave a few moments for some questions. I think that it makes sense for us to consider engaging social networks as a mechanism. It probably can and does extend campaign reach, but it probably doesn't do so uniformly. And insofar as that matters for you from a campaign objective perspective, you need to pay attention to that. So this is something that is a larger picture observation that we might have. Geographic and socioeconomic disparities persist despite the era that we live in which we tend to not think about geography very much. This is interesting to me as we start to move some of the implications to this into thinking about social media. Because that's an area where all of a sudden we start to talk about transcending geographic boundaries, and yet this social science and medicine paper is sort of a throwback in some ways because I'm suggesting place still matters. So there's an interesting tension there. And I want to explore further the extent to which this disappears when you're in a social media environment, or whether you see some of these same dynamics continue to occur. Regardless, I think it's worthwhile putting on the table. From a practical and applied standpoint, how is it that you get peer-to-peer information sharing? How is it you get referral or nomination? It's still unclear. There's enough reason to think that from a budgetary standpoint and from a results standpoint that this reliance on altruism may in fact be a good way to go. But then we need to start to raise the question whether or not this is altogether altruistic. Are women in these circumstances actually getting something out of that nomination, and are they more likely to get something out of that nomination in certain communities and certain circles? And of course, I would argue that they are. So this isn't altruism in the purest sense, perhaps. Community leadership can be gained. There are all kinds of ways in which these nominations may serve as currency in other ways. So this is a question that we need to explore further, and there are a number of places that we might do that. We need a lot more work to fill in some of these gaps. So my whole goal here today really is just to outline briefly a couple things we've been doing in recent years, but rather to point out, gosh, there's a lot of work at what might seem like a marginal intersection of some of these areas. I actually think there's some central questions that we can raise. In order to get at this, ultimately, what we really are going to need is an interdisciplinary look at this. One of the reasons why, last year I was so happy to be in a place that values doing not only interdisciplinary health communication research, but where there are these myriad connections between departments and people. And so I think, at the end of the day, that folks in Carroll Hall have a central role to play in this. But I also think we're going to need a lot of help. It's going to be the case that campaign evaluators are going to be useful, folks who are thinking about mass communication research, obviously, but we also need more work and need to be working hand in hand with social network researchers, folks that are doing social epi, behavioral medicine folks, and others. I think there are great opportunities for us to not only find some interesting dynamics, but to really re-envision the way that we do campaign evaluation, because I think we're overlooking a number of things. We're overlooking some of this indirect spread in the way that we assess exposure. That's a critical point that's central to campaign evaluation. And I also think that we're overlooking the fact that there are these inherent disparities that even efforts that are actively targeting those disparities may be reinforcing under certain circumstances because of the simple mechanism that's used. And so think about that the next time that you're relying on a viral marketing effort, because I think that's an interesting question. So with that in mind, I do want to invite a conversation and some challenges to some of the work and questions you might have. Yeah, Dr. Shaw.
Back to the very first slide you had.
Sure.
First one.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
I will. Go ahead. I'm listening to you.
I was just curious about you were talking about studies of mass behavior.
Mm-hmm.
The phrase mass behaviors in there.
Yeah. No, what do I?
I'm just curious how you might define what you mean by mass behavior.
That's a great question. And so on some level, a struggle to conceptualize that really gets at the core of really what I'm talking about. So is this something that you're talking about as an aggregate of individual behavior, or are we thinking about wider populations and the way that they act? It's a unit of analysis question. So it's there ambiguously, partly to be provocative, and so you raise exactly the right point. What is it that we mean? Are we talking about a bunch of individuals and then just sort of looking at the aggregate behavior across them, or what might we start to think about a different way of conceptualizing that?
I was just thinking, like, I was turning over my head, voting, I
Mm-hmm.
guess that would be mass behavior. People go that day and they vote. They react to a soccer game as an Egypt.
Right.
But people don't react as, I'm just, timing's involved in this too. So what you're studying does not all happen at the same time.
Absolutely. So we can go back to Laban and others in terms of thinking about distinctions between crowds and publics and masses, and those distinctions matter. And so we don't want to be careful not to sort of use these words and phrases too carefully. And under some of those conceptualizations, my awareness of and my interaction with others around me is going to be part of the experience. The whole notion of emotional contagion, or other the Egypt that's a great circumstance, in which I might need to start to think about behavior spreading or occurring in that context, as opposed to occurring in isolation. Our conventional mass notion often has this atomized picture of us that I think makes some sense. It may be reflective of the society that we live in, and yet there are circumstances in which what we do is in the place of, or it's within a context and within a social network as well. So that's a great. I appreciate you raising that. Yeah.
Some of these differences between how different types of community behave.
Yep.
Do you think it's because there are less connections, or do you think it's because the individuals have connections but they behave in a different way between each other?
Could you state that question? It was hard to hear.
Yeah.
So I was just asking if some of these differences you see in the communities, is it sort of structural issue that maybe people with lower SES have less connections, or is it they behave differently in their relationships between each other? They may not think to refer as a behavioral issue, not that they don't have enough connections to refer.
Right. So there is a bit of a chicken and egg issue there. What leads? So there's a question that we don't answer. What leads to the establishment of these community ties in the first place, and to what extent and how does that occur? And that's something that we're a bit, and pardon that the phrase, but we're a bit agnostic to in that circumstance, because we don't really have the data to look at mechanism there. But I agree. I think that it's sort of a little of both. I think that there's some room for individual behavior to have led to some of these patterns, but functionally, at the end of the day, the existence of, I guess here's one way of putting it. We wouldn't want to suggest that this is without sort of naturally occurring patterns, and that you could somehow assign people arbitrarily to be in a condition where there were more or less connections and then expect that to have just an overarching influence. It's probably bound up in some of those dynamics that you're talking about as well. But nonetheless, so you could argue that this is partly we've observed this phenomenon of disparity, but then we really need to go further to explain how it's going to arise and come about. I think the notion that referral means something in different circumstances is absolutely head on to something really interesting. And that's something that you could even argue that the moderating impact of stability suggests that congregation density itself means something different in those different circumstances. So what does it mean in a circumstance or a community where there's high instability and you've got high congregation density? Is it institutional effort to rush in and try to bridge gaps and to try to do something and address? And so is it reactive to that very instability, as opposed to other circumstances where there's high stability and those are naturally occurring, or that congregation density reflects, it's probably more reflective of simply people being connected to one another. So those are all really interesting questions institutionally. How is it that there's these disparities? It's one thing that was eye-opening for me is just the fact that congregation density itself varies so much by virtue of zip code, and community ties, you might argue, does as well. I don't know if that answers your question. You're onto something really interesting, and it's something that I think we need to explore further.
I just wonder if you chose a different behavior to refer.
Yep.
If you would see differences.
No.
Is it also a function of what you're asking people to do?
Right. So in 2012, I think in Minnesota, talking about breast cancer screening and mammography is not vulnerable to some of the social taboos that A, it would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago, and B, that some other diseases and topics might be. So you might think about HIV screening, or think about colorectal cancer, or think about other areas where I imagine that you may have either more reticence or might have to think twice as to what it means to refer somebody to this particular behavior. What I'd love to do next, and so this really connects nicely, is to think about a continuum of of behaviors and continuum of circumstances. So there's the behavior question. There's also the question of whether or not the Upper Midwest is kind of a quirky and idiosyncratic place, which, having lived there, it is in a wonderful way in a lot of ways. But does that mean can we replicate that in North Carolina? And what does that mean? Or even thinking internationally, and that's been something I've thought about as well. So you're raising really good questions, and that's where I think we need to head next with this. Here are some initially intriguing findings, but then how does this replicate across behaviors, across contexts, and might we see some moderation and variation in the patterns? Great. Yeah.
Just to follow on that, seems like there are some studies or references to studies directly on this in Nan Lin's social network, social capital book. I think it's Theory in Action.
Absolutely.
It's a brown cover, and by the guy Duke Nan Lin. He studies internationally. He does a lot of Chinese villages and stuff, so you wouldn't have this congregation measure necessarily. You'd have some other measures of success, and he tries to look for. I remember one study, the two villages are very much apart, but one, through exercising its social capital, becomes very wealthy by placing people in different positions of power. Right. And so this notion that social capital can be leveraged and that it isn't inherently, it might be useful, but not inherently.
Exactly. That's great. Yes, and so I'd agree. And then also think about cultural differences. If we're in a more individualistic versus collectivist society, how that might impact things. There are all kinds of really great questions.
The other part that just to bring up, when you were talking about how acquaintance relationship stuff is actually very well supported by Wellman and by Richard Florida's reports probably in the last 2 weeks.
Okay.
I think Wellman was just on NPR about this one, about Twitter, your Twitter followers following airline clubs.
Interesting.
Say that again, Paul. What?
That
Twitter?
When you map your people's Twitter networks and overlay them, they happen to actually match the airline pub system.
That's really neat.
He got an NPR soundbite out of that.
Right.
But the paper has more stuff in it, the little bit that I've read on it.
I'll have to follow up with you to get that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I forget what it's called. I'll look it up. And then Richard Florida has one that I think he praised in his Atlantic thing called "How Twitter Proves That Place Matters." It looks like.
Right.
Geography of Twitter networks is the Wellman.
Great.
But he also has done stuff on how people maintain connections after moving.
Yep.
Earlier on, before just with email.
Absolutely, and that theme is something sort of in all kinds of ways. Just the simple statement that geography still matters in 2012, I think, is an interesting one, and that's something that has all kinds of implications for the work that we do in a place like this.
So I did have a question.
Oh, great! Yeah.
Now that I've done that part,
that's fine.
I was thinking about mass audience, but I'm going to shelve that.
Okay, sure.
And think about how you define in the very beginning idle chatter, because I keep thinking of Robin Dunbar's grooming gossip and the evolution of language, and his sort of physical anthropological approach to
right. So I'm
small talk, idle chatter, and context,
right,
and gossip,
right,
which Dunbar loves.
Right, and actually, so there's and gossip itself is a really fascinating topic. I had a chance. I've published a couple of papers with my own graduate student Brian Weeks on thinking about rumor and gossip as it related to coverage of the Obama campaign a couple of years ago, and thinking about ways that connects to online search and other things. I think my use of that up there is intentionally provocative, simply to point out a phenomena that we might otherwise dismiss. And so I don't have any necessarily deeper reasons for conceptualizing that way, but rather to suggest, look, this mundane small talk itself might be functional and matter in all kinds of ways that we aren't realizing right now. That it's a mechanism through which not only ideas are spreading, but it's constant reminders on a daily basis, thinking about in a classic way how certain things continue to get thought about and put on the table, and others don't. So there's all kinds of
cases to substitute for room.
Yes, right.
But I think also fair enough.
The what?
It makes people pay attention to each other and trust.
Absolutely.
It stimulates fair enough.
Well, and then we can go the biological route too. I think
he's a physical anthropologist, so it's all biological.
Right, but so it would make sense then that my allusion to it being strategic behavior would make some sense
Yes,
too.
it's a that's how the pedagogists would say that's how your strategic behavior operationalizes.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think there are definite connections here. I don't know, Jan, I want to step on your.
I think back to an earlier point about cultural differences and
Yep.
that, and sort of about privacy, I think, and norms of privacy,
Mm-hmm.
and especially on health issues, about who you are willing to talk with about private health issues,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then in some cultures that would be more possible than in others.
Absolutely.
And it may be, I don't know whether, I was thinking in China as well, there used to be, that in a collective society, when we've been studying some HIV, doing some HIV work there, where your STD test was out on a book, in a book.
Yeah.
And everybody comes in and sees whose results.
Right.
Everybody's results, like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what you point to is something we're very used to thinking about, the utility of tailoring messages, of the fact that we're going to see a variation in circumstances. Certain groups are going to respond differently to certain messages, and thinking about it from the persuasive standpoint. We're less used to thinking about those variations as they relate to this mundane mechanism of talk and connection to one another. And so that's where I think this becomes really interesting, is that we need to pay attention not only into what messages might resonate, but circumstances in which reliance on these kind of connections between folks might itself vary in really important and critical ways. And so you're absolutely right for raising that. And I think it's the reason to kind of turn attention away from Minnesota to look at can we come up with a theory of essentially what we were trying to do or trying to generate that special issue. Part of the original solicitation was, and our intro to that suggests that, all right, now we need to figure out circumstances under which when these types of things matter. There's a nice piece that we ended up publishing in that